Hey, this is David Wolinsky back again with another interview from the audio archives of no, doesnt, theyre.com. This is part two of my conversation with Neil Druckmann, the Naughty Dog creative director. This interview took place on May 18th, 2016. If you like what you hear in these interviews and the work I'm doing overall, please give me some love on the Patreon. And if you want to read a full transcript of this conversation, click the link in the description below. Thanks. I mean, do you feel like the types of things? Yeah, do you feel like the types of things that the audience for games doesn't understand about how they're made? Is it any different from things that the media, the games media, or even mainstream media doesn't understand?
No, it depends because I guess there's so many viewpoints in media, right? There's like,
Right.
if I go on Metacritic or something and look at the reviews for Uncharted 4, there's like 100 reviews. So you're going to get all sorts of different opinions and perspectives, and each one of those people has a different understanding of production and how the games are made. And some people have like a pretty deep understanding and they kind of see those things. Some people don't. It's interesting that now I see a lot of reviews, and actually I'm really encouraged by this, where they're critiquing the story more in depth, and they're talking about character arcs and motivations and relationships, both positive and negatively towards our games, but I just like the depth of the discussion. And I think it's pretty new for games, because usually it would just be like, oh, the story was intriguing, or great voice acting, and that would be it, and that would be next to like fun factor, or game length, or value. And now I'm finding it's like, no, that part actually made me reflect on my life and my relationship with my wife and how my writing career has actually gone in the way of my relationship. And so it's kind of cool that people are dissecting them in that way. And I would say the next step for me that I would want from game criticism is, and there's a few people that have this, but I think more people need this, especially as they're diving into narrative deconstruction, is a better understanding of the craft of writing. Which I think you see more in, like, let's say, film criticism. That language is kind of lacking for me in some of the game criticism.
I've written some reviews in my day, and I do see this happen to some of my colleagues, where people in the audience, sort of in the comments, or they'll come at you on social media, and this is sort of meant to be a disdainful or dismissive comment, where they say, your game review is almost like a film review.
Yeah, like... we get that sometimes, where cinematic is a pejorative, where I see cinematic as you're telling a story succinctly with images.
Yeah. Well, I mean, speaking of just critics and new voices and viewpoints that have come up in the last couple of years, I mean, it's very noticeable, in Uncharted 4, where there seems to be a spotlight put on female characters, and I think I have read or seen you talk about just sort of how inspiring you found Anita Sarkeesian's work. But I was just curious, is the spotlight on female characters, is this sort of a natural extension of what you did in Last of Us, or were there other influences as well?
Well, the biggest influence, more than anything, by a large factor, is my daughter. Since starting The Last of Us, I had my first kid, and that kind of is also what drew me to some of the media criticism of someone like Anita Sarkeesian.
Yeah.
And then, reading some other books about the impact that media can have on kids' self-esteem, who they look up to, who they try to emulate, and realizing there's kind of a dearth of compelling female characters in media in general, but more specifically in games, the media I mostly dabble in.
Right.
And felt like, this is actually something I could have an impact on. This is something I could be more thoughtful about. So I just became really interested in, I guess, female characters, and more recently just diversity in general. And there's certain people on the team that are even more versed in that kind of criticism than me, one of which I mention often is Ashley Swodowski. She's our lead character concept artist. which is kind of a great position for someone that's thinking about that stuff. And she's constantly challenging, like, you know, just the way my mind works, I'll come up with a character, and my initial version of the character might be a white male. And she will challenge that and say, okay, what if it was a woman? And an example of that with Uncharted 4 is the epilogue, where when I was writing the epilogue, thinking about it, I thought, for production, this was my thing, for production reasons, Nate will have a son. We can use the same model as the kid from the flashback sequences. So, okay, maybe at first you'll think it's another flashback sequence, and then I get twisted, and you realize it's Nate's son, and I'm just talking to her about these kind of story ideas, and she kind of sat back and was like, oh, what if it was a girl? What if you had a girl? And I'm like, oh, I just think about it that way. Oh, let's take a second, let's try to imagine it. Like, yeah, it's kind of cool, and then, like, you could project more of Elena into it, and kind of, yeah, that sounds exciting. Let's do that.
Why do you think, this is sort of an unanswerable question, but it is unusual to hear someone in, you know, the bigger budget video game space answer a question like this. But I mean, that's a very, you know, reasonable work through of like, oh yeah, this could just be that way. Why do you think that has been so difficult for some portions of the video game audience to sort of go through that mental thought process and sort of, oh, okay, that's fine. That actually doesn't change anything.
It's hard to answer for the industry at large. I could say some of the stuff I've gone through, and I could see the pitfalls, which is, you know, I have just a limited viewpoint on life based on the experience I've had. So that's why it's good to have a more diverse team, or just to develop a process where you're constantly challenging your assumptions. And I think that's just good across the board to avoid cliche narrative moments, or just anything to say, is this the most unique and original we can be? Is there something more interesting than this initial idea? So I think that's just a good process to have creatively for anything.
Mm-hmm.
In time,
go ahead.
It took me time to develop that muscle or that kind of instinct. And then the other thing is marketing, I find, by its very nature, tends to be risk averse. And if you look at like where games were, and it's kind of a chicken and egg thing. Statistically, games used to be this teenage boys. You would think of games, you would think of teenage boys, and if you look at marketing for games in the 90s, it's all aimed at male, straight teenage boys.
Yeah.
Through and through. So then, having that kind of lineage, that heritage, that, you know, when you make a game that stars a female character, or has a really strong female character, then the mindset might be like, oh, that's going to be harder to market because teenage boys don't want to play as a girl. And that's true for some of them. As another kind of side anecdote, when we did focus testing for Uncharted 4, where we bring players in, have them play through the game and give feedback, we had a couple, by the end of production, we have tested, over 200 people have played through the game at various stages of its development. And there were a handful of them, guys, that had issues with some of the narrative beats revolving women in the story. So much so we had to ask one to leave because he had such a physical reaction, especially to the epilogue when he's playing as Cassie. He was so upset and just started cursing, and I don't know what the point of that story is. I would say, I guess maybe the point is you could see that, and if you have the mentality of like, I just need to please the focus testers, then you might say, oh, this introduces risk.
Right.
You're so worried about making money back, not sitting an audience, and not making a wave.
Oop, I'm sorry, getting a little noise there. I think that is true, and I do think sort of when people do criticize the big budget space, there is a lot of talk of risk aversion. But I feel like something that I never hear discussed is, what do you feel are the sorts of like What do you feel are the risks that bigger budget games take, and sort of what are sort of, maybe you can speak from games you've worked on, sort of like what are some of the really, the high risk type things you've tried that just didn't make it into the final product? Because those are also things we never hear about.
Usually things that don't make it into the game for us are just something we just can't fit it due to time constraints, or we realize that for pacing reasons, like there's a big set piece that we cut out of Uncharted 4, and it was partially for production, just to get the game done, but also because we looked at a sequence of 3 events in a row that were big kind of set pieces. And it felt like, as we're looking at the schedule and we're seeing like, we have too much game for the amount of time that we have, what can we lose? And like, well, here we have 3 set pieces in a row. We could easily lose this middle one, but these other 2 together, and no one will know any better until I mention it in an interview, and then people will know about it.
Right.
So those are the things we usually cut. I have never cut anything due to trying to avoid controversy. If anything, whenever like I feel that instinct or that fear come on, I hang on to the idea even more.
Right.
And one of those is you might have seen, when we first announced Nadine, the fact that we had a black character played by a white actress was turned out to be quite controversial. And that came to being due to a bunch of different reasons, and I knew that would be a little controversial, but I felt like it was important for the game. The situation, whatever reasons we've ended up with that choice, that was the right choice for the game, and no matter what, I'm going to hang on to it. I'm not going to change anything due to fear. And that's something, I'm kind of proud of, that I don't operate out of fear, or a fear of the market. How is the market going to react to this? I find the character compelling. I find the performance, I would say, superb of what Laura gave to it. And I think the combination of the look and the performance of that character is something I've never seen in a video game, that I was going to fight for it. I didn't even fight for it even in the wrong way. I didn't have to fight for it. It's just I wasn't going to mitigate it in some way.
I mean, that's sort of related to something else I wanted to ask, which is, you're from Israel originally, right?
Yeah.
So, I mean, I'm curious, like, how do you feel that you channel, that sort of, heritage or identity in your games? Or, I mean, do you feel like media you were exposed to from Israel, has that informed the way you approach games at all?
That's a very interesting question that I never really thought about. I don't know how much this applies to Uncharted, but definitely with The Last of Us. There's something about whatever. I was thinking about I don't know if there's a delicate way to phrase it. There's something about the way foreigners view the United States is different from how Americans view the United States. And
this is true.
For me, there's sort of like, I always grew up with this sort of admiration. Like, I would consume so many like movies and comic books and dreaming of going to Disneyland when I lived in Israel, that there's a certain appreciation and like a deconstruction and a love for things American, that I think if you play The Last of Us with that lens, you see it all over the place. Like when you're driving, when Joel and Ellie enter Pittsburgh, and Ellie's looking out the window at these skyscrapers. That's me when I first came to the United States and driving through Manhattan and looking up at these. It's like, because I remember when we first like arrived in the United States and we landed in like, I think we first went to Long Island or something, or we had some distant cousins that lived there and we stayed with them. And I'm looking around and seeing these suburbs and I'm like, yeah, I guess this is not what I imagined the United States to be. And then we took a train that becomes a subway, and you walk out of the subway station to Manhattan, and you walk out and you see these skyscrapers, and there's a Statue of Liberty. It's like, and I remember having this like awe of like, yes, this is more what I imagined the United States to be. And there's something of that I tried to capture with The Last of Us. I guess that's the most kind of clear example. I don't know if there's anything more than that.
Oh, there may not. Yeah, I mean, I didn't know if there would even be anything, so it was just I was curious to ask. Um, I mean, trying to figure out sort of. I mean, I saw something very recently, and I'm sure you've heard, and I'm sure you know, and I've been hearing this for a while. Just sort of, budgets for bigger budget games. Like I saw earlier this month that Gears of War 4, what would have cost Epic $100 million. I mean, there is sort of an escalating cost curve that's been happening in video games since the 80s. I mean, is there ever concern or discussion? I mean, are you guys worried about, like, are these types of games sustainable?
I guess we haven't had that discussion, like some kind of existential crisis for the studio.
Yeah.
We are aware that the budgets are ballooning, and at the same time, for us, they've been more and more successful.
Mm-hmm.
So it's good that those curves are kind of lining up with each other. I think we're going to hit some kind of diminishing, or that curve for the cost is going to flatten, I think, relatively soon. Because as far as like the things that cost a lot are, well, the thing that costs the most for us are salaries for the developers in-house. So the more developers you have, the more expensive the game's going to be. Mocap, the technology behind mocap of like R&D and then like renting a soundstage and bringing actors on board. I feel like that's for the most part is going to flatten. I don't see it getting more expensive than what it is now.
Mm-hmm.
If anything, it might start getting cheaper sometime in the near future. And hopefully, right, again, I look at sales of the PS4 and it doesn't look like consoles are dying or the amount of I think we're going to get more and more people that accept games that are gamers. So I guess because I think we've hit. I'm really bad at predicting the future, by the way, so I don't know.
No, that's okay. I won't hold you to it.
But I feel like we've seen the worst of it as far as like, yeah, these games have gotten more expensive and all the studios that can make this kind of game have shut down or have gone kind of more lower budget versions of these games. You're not seeing the middle budget version anymore. But I think we've seen the worst of it. And I think if anything, the indie games are going to get more and more sophisticated as tools get better and cheaper. As a quick example of that, like Crash Bandicoot took a whole team for Naughty Dog to make over like, I don't know how many, like a year plus of production. Crash Bandicoot in Uncharted 4 was one scripter. So it's just like games are getting harder to make, and yet they're getting easier to make if you look at the games we used to make. So like Uncharted 4 right now is that's a big budget, expensive game that very few teams can make that kind of game. But in a few years, I think there's going to be a bunch of teams that can make the kind of games that we've made now.
How many people made Uncharted 4? How many people were on your team or teams?
In-house, I believe these are all very rough numbers.
Yeah.
In-house, we were at the height of production around 300 people, and then you could double that with all the people we worked with externally.
I mean, what do you feel are the strengths of large teams versus smaller teams?
The most obvious is the amount of game you can make. Like when you play Uncharted 4, you're going through so many environments and so many different looks, and that takes a lot of people. A lot of people that have an eye for detail, right? To really sell and immerse you in when you're in Libertalia. And there's so many details you're just walking by, you're probably not even noticing, but you kind of have to get to that level of insane degree of detail for you to be immersed in that world, because when you notice something missing, it takes you out. And then you look at the amount of animations, and we have like hours upon hours upon hours of just in-game movement for Nate, of stuff that was motion captured and then put into the game. We have over 3 hours of cinematics in this game, so that's more than we could do internally. Just the scope is probably the first thing that comes to mind. The con is the chaos that it introduces, that you have to communicate a vision to so many people, sometimes on different parts of the world, to make sure that all these parts are being developed by different people all come together and feel like there's a unified look and voice to this thing at the end.
So I know you said that you're bad at predicting the future, and you did sort of mention, you think or hope at least that like these escalating costs are going to sort of level off. But have you felt a way that the escalating cost of production has it sort of impacted the types of games that people seem able to make in AAA?
If I try to just look at patterns, it seems like you're seeing fewer genres. Fewer new genres, at least in AAA. There's a lot of sequels, again, because they're trying to mitigate risk. And it's like, well, if this game was successful, at the very least, slapping this name on the next. And again, maybe I'm being a bit too harsh on it because we just made Uncharted 4.
Yeah.
Yeah, I could see that. I could see how it's harder and harder probably to pitch a new IP, a new kind of game, and say it's also going to cost a lot of money to make this new game. You're seeing it like you're seeing from Guerrilla Games are making Horizon, and I'm super excited for that. When we did The Last of Us, people were telling us, a lot of people in the industry were telling us we're crazy. Like we're doing a new IP at the end of a generation. It's going to come out after the next generation is already going to be announced. It's going to bomb. It's going to bomb hard. And we just felt like, I don't know what we felt like. I'm sure my bosses probably thought about it differently and more logically. For me, it was like just like, fuck it. Like this is a cool idea. We're really excited. We have the go-ahead from Sony. We're just going to make this thing and see how it does. And by the way, when we made The Last of Us, Bruce and I thought this game would never be as successful as Uncharted. We're making something way more niche. It just can't be. And it turned out to be, at the time, the most successful game we've made.
I mean, I think, you did mention that, and this is true of Uncharted 4, where it takes a while before you as Nate are shooting at other people. But I mean, I'm sort of curious, and this is sort of one of the things I explore in this interview series is just when do you feel like we can start breaking bigger budget games out of still that cycle of shooting, looting, and running? Because I mean, I think back to you mentioned Half-Life. I think back to something like Shenmue, even in a game like that, you can go to work and you could carry books and you can catch a leaf, you could do all these other types of things. When do you think it might be possible to see bigger budget games break out of that cycle?
I don't know if you ever will. And the only reason I can say that is I look at the film industry and say, okay, what are the biggest budget movies? Okay, let's just think of a few, right? It's like, okay, Star Wars: The Force Awakens, that has a lot of shooting and fighting and killing.
It's at least the seventh sequel, yeah.
Transformers, Fast and Furious. I guess what's the AAA Titanic? What's the AAA version of Gravity? I'm trying to, but like in film there are like these exceptions. But for the most part, the biggest budget movies is like Mad Max. It's all something, and there's something about, and I don't know how to articulate it exactly, but something about stories with this external conflict that's the easiest for people to relate to and quickly jump into and escape in. As you're getting more sophisticated and more subtle, I don't know if I guess I hesitate now because I don't even know if that's true necessarily because I think you could lose people. You could definitely lose people if that's the only thing you have. Right, as great as Gone Home is, Gone Home doesn't have the numbers of Call of Duty or Uncharted or, no, you could say that's marketing. But I think Gone Home is this more subtle, nuanced experience that you have to be a little more sophisticated to appreciate.
Yeah.
So the thing that I'm more interested in is like, how do I take this genre, and I want to draw those people that normally would not play a Gone Home or would not be as interested in a game that has that kind of level of subtlety and sophistication, and how do I get them to fall in love with that kind of stuff within this genre? To maybe kind of educate them and get them to become more sophisticated so that we could venture out. So, and you see, like, we've kind of done that, like, with The Last of Us and then Left Behind and now Uncharted 4, where the games, they're still action, right? They're still, like, thrilling in that kind of very basic level. But within it, there's a certain level of character-driven sophistication that I hope people are appreciating on a massive scale.
Yeah, sort of.
So going forward, we can't go even like we're just like it's evolving it, and what does it mean to be an action film? And some of my favorite action films that I can think of, they have very little action in them, and they're very good in their restraint and how much action they're throwing on the screen. It's like Children of Men has been a huge influence. Even when I think of Gravity, it's like, right, that film is filled with action, but I guess it's not shooting, it's not killing. So maybe games have to find that way of creating thrill without necessarily resorting to violence. If someone took that on and said, like, okay, that's going to be my goal with this game.
Well, so I only have just a couple more questions for you. I wanted to ask, this is sort of an odd thing to zero in on. I wanted to ask a little bit about the photo mode in Uncharted 4. Now, this is something I've heard for a while, is that, like, I think maybe back to Crackdown is the first game I heard where this was sort of discussed, where sort of social media and people sharing images of their playing games online sort of being taken into account as far as, like, designing games and sort of what happens in them. I mean, is that sort of an overstatement of things? Like, are portions of bigger budget games designed specifically for people to share screenshots on them? Like, it's just sort of added just for that, or is it a much more subtle thing along the way?
There's nothing that we do during the making of the game where, like, how can people share this? For us, photo mode, I'm trying to remember. I think it was infamous Second Son is the first time I've noticed it, and I think a lot of people on the team took notice of it. Where people were taking pictures and the game looked amazing, and it felt like, oh, that's something our games could really benefit from. And we did that on The Last of Us Remastered. I think that we didn't have it on the PS3 version. Mm-hmm. And then so going into Uncharted 4, we already knew we were going to have that mode, and I guess we were just thinking more of like, what kind of filters, what kind of tools can we give you to play with? And with this game, we added the ability to just turn off characters, or you could just take pictures of the environment. So I guess when it's time to get to that mode, and that mode is one of the lowest priorities as far as finishing the game, which is why it was only part of our day one patch. But when we get to it, we are more conscious that, that is a big part of how people are enjoying the game. What tools within this can we give them to, express themselves in some way through playing the game?
Okay, well, so this will be my second to last question for you. This is also a little bit of an odd one, but I remember, at least I found this on YouTube many years ago, but for Uncharted 3, I think it was like a Japanese promotional video with Harrison Ford playing the game. Uh-huh. I don't know if you were involved with that at all, but sort of like, what is the story behind that? Sort of like, who was that intended to try to, turn heads of?
I actually am not. No one on the development side was involved in that. That was a marketing idea. And I believe that was a Japanese marketing idea specifically. Yes, yeah. Where they had some opportunity to have Harrison Ford play the game and use that as a way to market it. But that's as far as I know of how that came to be.
I mean,
I thought it was awesome. I thought it was kind of like, here's clearly someone whose work we've admired and been inspired from, and he's sort of playing our game. He's not quite holding the controller right, but...
I think he's like in his hotel room or something. It seems like he just woke up or something.
Right.
Okay, well, so this is a very broad final question for you. I ask this of everyone I interview. What do you think video games have accomplished?
Wow, that is a very broad question. I don't even know where to start because they've accomplished so much. I guess I could just ramble for a while.
Sure.
Well, I guess first it's almost like asking what has art accomplished. Because you could look at it from so many avenues, like from technology. Video games have been at the forefront of pushing, graphics and getting people to upgrade their graphics cards and new consoles competing with each other so they could this console war of getting the best graphics out there. And that's been, if you think of like in such a short time from, I don't know, Pac-Man to now, how different games look and have evolved, and it's thanks to that kind of competition. They've created careers. They've inspired people to pursue careers, myself included. They have given people, sounds really weird, but have given people hope and a form of escape when they've been at low points in their lives. And there's people that, I don't know, go to many conventions, but whenever I do, I always have some group of people come up to me and tell me how much The Last of Us or Uncharted has helped them at like some difficult part in their life. And Ashley Johnson, who played Ellie in The Last of Us, told me a story of how this girl came up to her and told her she played Left Behind, and because we get to see that Ellie in that story is a lesbian, and she was so connected with that character that gave her the courage to come out to her family. I think video games, I guess in the simplest form, have accomplished art, which is they've helped people view the world a little differently, maybe behave a little differently, maybe pursue their own passions a little differently. And I guess that's all you can ask for from any kind of art to do.